There was a time when stepping outside meant stepping out of reach. No tracking, no check-ins, no constant connection, just an unspoken understanding that you'd make your way back. If you grew up in that narrow window between the late analog world and the early digital one, your life was shaped by two completely different realities colliding. You weren't fully rooted in either. You didn't grow up entirely in the self-reliant, disconnected world that defined those before you, but you also weren't raised inside the seamless, always-on systems that came after. You developed in the overlap, and that comes with a subtle but lasting tension. Identity usually anchors itself in a clear environment. You didn't have that luxury. You learned to operate across two systems without fully belonging to either. That dual exposure rewired how you think. You carry memories from a slower, more tactile world alongside the early thrill of digital discovery. Neither feels foreign, both feel incomplete on their own. So instead of clinging to one, you became someone who adjusts. Someone who can move between ways of thinking, communicating, and living without needing to fully commit to any single one. You experienced a version of time that doesn't exist anymore. Long stretches where nothing was happening, and that wasn't a problem to fix. It was just how life felt. With no constant input, your mind had to generate its own stimulation. You built ideas from nothing. You entertained yourself without tools. What people now describe in scientific terms as internal cognitive processing was simply your everyday state. You also developed patience in a way that feels almost foreign today. Things didn't arrive instantly. You had to wait. For moments, for people, for outcomes. And because there was no alternative, you adapted. That waiting built emotional endurance. It trained you to handle uncertainty without immediate resolution. Your relationships were grounded in physical presence. You learned how to read expressions, shifts in tone, and the weight of silence. Discomfort wasn't something you could avoid with a tap. It had to be faced, worked through, and resolved in real time. That shaped how you understand connection, conflict, and trust. And then, there was stillness. Not isolation, but uninterrupted space. Time when nothing competed for your attention. Your thoughts had room to expand, loop, and settle. You became familiar with your own mind without distraction, constantly pulling you away from it. That kind of upbringing is disappearing. And it left you with something most people now struggle to develop. The ability to sit with yourself without needing immediate stimulation, to create without external input, and to exist without being constantly engaged or observed. You were formed just before everything accelerated, right before attention became something to capture and hold. And as you were stepping into who you were becoming, the entire structure of the world shifted beneath your feet. The shift didn't unfold slowly. It cut straight through the most vulnerable stage of your life, when your sense of self was still being shaped, still unstable, still searching for definition. Right in that moment, the rules of reality changed. You experienced two entirely different systems of connection within just a few years. First, a world where communication was fixed, physical, and limited. Then suddenly, a new layer appeared. Digital, instant, and expanding. You weren't just exposed to both. You had to learn them side by side, while still figuring out who you were. That forced you to develop a rare kind of mental flexibility. You became fluent in two modes of existence. One grounded in presence, reading faces, feeling pauses, understanding what silence means. The other built on abstraction, interpreting text, constructing identity through words, connecting without physical presence. Most people only know one of these natively. You had to master both. For you, the digital world didn't start as reality. It was an environment you entered deliberately. There was a clear separation. You stepped into it, explored it, and then stepped back out. That boundary gave you perspective. It made the online space feel optional, not inevitable. But over time, that separation eroded. What used to be a destination became the default setting. The distinction between online and real life faded until it was almost meaningless. And because you remember when that line existed, you carry an awareness most people don't. You know that constant connection wasn't always the baseline. That awareness changes how you perceive modern life. You've seen a version of reality that had limits, where presence and absence were clearly defined. So even now, there's a part of you that recognizes how much has shifted, even if others take it for granted. At the same time, your place within generational identity has never felt fully settled. You can understand the mindset of those who grew up entirely offline, their independence, their skepticism. You can also understand those shaped entirely by digital systems, their fluidity, their adaptability. But understanding both doesn't mean you fully belong to either. So instead of anchoring yourself in one identity, you developed a different skill. Translation. You move between perspectives. You adjust to different environments. You read both sides of the divide without fully committing to one. This creates a quiet internal dynamic. Not confusion, but a kind of neutrality. You're not disconnected. You're just not confined. You operate across contexts, rather than inside a single one. And while that can sometimes feel like a lack of clear identity, it also gives you something most people struggle to develop: the ability to understand different worlds without being trapped in any of them. There's a trade-off that comes with growing up across two incompatible worlds. Without a single cultural frame to anchor you, identity doesn't form through reinforcement. It has to be assembled. You don't inherit a clean narrative. You build one yourself, stitching together experiences that were never meant to fit neatly. Over time, your mind adapts. It learns how to hold contradiction without breaking, how to connect timelines that don't align, how to remain stable even when the context shifts. You aren't caught between eras. You're the living result of a transition. Your early years were shaped by a moment in history that felt unusually steady. The broader story was optimistic, almost unquestioned. Progress seemed linear. Opportunity felt accessible. The future was framed as something reliable. You prepare for it, and it rewards you. And as a child, you accept that story without resistance. That's how development works. You trust the structure you're given. But that structure didn't hold. Just as you began stepping into independence, the foundation started to fracture. The promise of a clear path gave way to instability. Systems that were presented as dependable suddenly proved fragile. And this didn't happen once. It happened repeatedly, at critical moments. Each disruption landed exactly when it mattered most. As you moved toward education and career, the landscape shifted. As you approached stability, the ground moved again. The pattern wasn't gradual, it was timed. And that timing leaves a mark. It teaches you something deeper than caution. It rewires your expectations. You still carry the belief that effort should lead somewhere. That was built into you early, but now it coexists with something else. An awareness that outcomes aren't guaranteed, that systems can collapse, that timing can override preparation. So, you don't move blindly. You move with awareness. You think ahead. You keep alternatives in mind. This creates a mindset that looks like optimism on the surface, but is structured around realism underneath. You don't abandon hope. You just don't rely on it alone. You anticipate disruption because you've already lived through it more than once. At the same time, the nature of connection itself transformed around you. You remember when communication had limits. When access to people and work was contained within specific times and places, there were natural boundaries that separated roles, environments, and expectations. Then those boundaries dissolved. Gradually, everything became accessible at once. Work followed you home. Conversations became continuous. The distinction between being available and being absent disappeared. Because you experienced both systems, this shift feels different to you. It doesn't feel normal. It feels like something that expanded beyond its original scope. You remember what it was like to not be reachable, to exist without constant input, to have moments that were truly disconnected. Now, that separation is gone. Life operates inside a continuous stream of demands, messages, and expectations. There's no clear endpoint to the day, no defined edge where things stop. And because you remember when those edges existed, you experience the modern world with a level of awareness others don't. You know this constant state isn't inevitable, it's something that emerged, and once you've seen the contrast, you can't fully ignore it. This is where the tension becomes constant, almost invisible, but always present. You've learned to function in a world that never switches off, but some part of you never accepted that as normal. Your system was built expecting breaks, clear pauses, moments where nothing is required, where attention can drop without consequence. But the environment you now live in rarely allows that, so there's a quiet strain that follows you, not overwhelming, but persistent. You move through a reality that demands continuous availability while carrying the memory of a different rhythm, one where connection had limits, where absence was allowed. The discomfort isn't about technology itself, it's about the fact that there is no longer a true off. What used to exist naturally now has to be created intentionally, and when you look at the next generation, the difference becomes even more obvious. Their starting point is completely different from yours. They don't transition into connected life. It's already there from the beginning. Their relationships, their risks, even their mistakes exist within systems that record, amplify, and extend everything. That creates a tension in how you guide them. You still measure childhood against a standard that no longer exists. You remember freedom without surveillance, time without structure, experiences that weren't documented or shared. You know how important those conditions were in shaping you. But you also understand that the world they're growing up in operates differently. You're forced into a balancing act with no clear answer. Too much restriction cuts them off from their reality. Too much exposure leaves them vulnerable in ways you never had to consider. So you adapt. You set limits where you can, explain risks your parents never had to define, and try to preserve fragments of an experience that no longer occurs naturally. Underneath that effort is something deeper than concern. It's the awareness that what shaped you cannot be fully passed on, not because you won't allow it, but because the conditions themselves are gone. So you don't replicate your childhood, you reinterpret it, translating its values into a completely different environment. That same pattern shows up in how you operate professionally. You often find yourself positioned between two fundamentally different ways of thinking. One side prioritizes structure, stability, and clearly defined roles. The other moves quickly, adapts constantly, and treats change as the default. You can see the logic in both. You understand why older systems rely on consistency and why newer ones prioritize speed. So, you naturally become the bridge. You explain one perspective to the other, not because it's your role, but because your experience allows you to understand both without bias. This isn't just adaptability, it's how your thinking was formed. You developed across two different models of how the world works. Instead of rejecting one in favor of the other, you learn to operate within both. That position comes with pressure, but it also comes with clarity. You don't just function inside a system, you see how different systems work, where they clash, and where they can align. What psychologists describe as cognitive flexibility isn't something you deliberately trained. It's something your environment forced you to develop. You grew up inside a moving system, so your mind learned to move with it, shifting perspectives, reconciling contradictions, and navigating differences without needing resolution. That's why you often become the stabilizer in group dynamics. You instinctively see where misunderstandings are coming from because you understand the logic behind both sides. When things stall, you reframe. When expectations clash, you translate. You don't just participate, you make interaction possible. But roles like that tend to go unnoticed. They only become visible when something breaks. So much of what you do operates in the background, connecting, aligning, smoothing transitions, not because you were told to, but because your experience naturally spans gaps that others don't even see. This same pattern extends into the structure of your life. By the time you reach midlife, responsibilities don't just grow, they stack. You're not just managing one direction of care, but two. Above you, aging parents require increasing attention, decisions, and support. Below you, children are navigating a world that demands more guidance than ever before. And in the middle of that, your own life is still taking shape. Stability didn't arrive early or cleanly. It came after delays, disruptions, and adjustments. So instead of a gradual progression, everything converges at once. Career, family, responsibility, identity. That creates a specific kind of pressure. It's not about a single role being overwhelming. It's about all of them drawing from the same limited capacity at the same time. You're expected to show up fully in every direction, even when there's no real space to recover. A quieter dynamic at play. You're central to everything, yet rarely recognized as the focus. Support moves through you more often than it moves toward you. You coordinate, you hold things together, you anticipate needs on both ends. And over time, that position creates its own kind of fatigue. Not dramatic, but constant. It's the strain of carrying multiple timelines at once, remembering what was, managing what is, and preparing for what's coming, all while still figuring out your own path forward. At the same time, there's something you carry that's becoming increasingly uncommon. Not just memories, but lived experience of a different pace of life. A time when attention wasn't constantly divided, when relationships unfolded without documentation, when thoughts could exist privately without being shared or performed. That perspective matters more now than it ever has. Because as the world accelerates and connection becomes continuous, the ability to step back, to pause, to reflect, to exist without constant input is no longer automatic. It's something that has to be remembered, valued, and intentionally preserved. You represent that memory, not as nostalgia, but as proof that another way of living existed, and that parts of it are still worth protecting. So if this feels familiar, understand this. You're not undefined, and you're not out of place. You're continuity. You're the link between systems, between speeds, between ways of being human. And that position, while often quiet, is more important than it looks.